people seriously pretend our climate policies in Australia might make our always deadly fire seasons safer? Let me take this up with Labor's Agriculture and Resources spokesman Joel Fitzgibbon, who joins me live from Canberra. Thanks for joining us, Joel. First up, I just want to ask you about Labor's 45% by 2030 emissions reduction target. You took that to the election. What's your target for 2030 now?
Well, nice try, Chris, but it is good to be back. Obviously, that target was embraced in 2015. And of course, that was some 15 years out from that 2030 deadline. And if we were to win the next election in 2022, we'd be just 6 or 7 years out from 2030. And given, as you pointed out, under Scott Morrison, carbon emissions have at best flatlined and arguably increased. I mean, they've gone down in the last couple of quarters, mainly because of the drought and its impact on agriculture. But given though that they will have at best flatlined, then of course the 2030 mission gets harder and harder. Smaller amount of time coming off a potentially higher base, certainly not a lower base.
Yeah, I think we can all cut Labor some slack when it comes to that issue, the fact that you've lost 3 years of a program that was really only over a decade, so you've sort of lost 30% of the time, so you might want to readjust your targets. But surely then the starting point has to be for Labor to go back to saying that you support the Paris Agreement. Surely your baseline should be the Paris Agreement targets that the government's still committed to, 26 to 28% by 2030.
Well, as I've said here before, Chris, and certainly I said in my Sydney Institute speech, our focus as the opposition for the next 2.5 years is to do all we can to hold Scott Morrison to account, to keep him to his commitment to stick to that 26 to 28% reduction. What is very, very clear now, as we speak, is that he's not on track. Despite the spin, meet and beat, I just don't know how he's allowed to get away with that spin. Despite the spin, he's not on track at all. There is no chance in the world on current trajectories, even with the use of carryover from Kyoto, the Prime Minister can meet that 26 to 28%.
The latest audit says that with the carryover credits, we're there already. I mean, so it's not going to be hard as long as you agree to use those carryover credits.
Well, no one's been able to demonstrate to me, Chris, at what point emissions start to decline. You made the point, by the way, that emissions have decoupled from economic growth, and that is a good thing. But no one has been able to demonstrate to me, certainly not the Prime Minister, that at some point in the near future, that flatlining we are seeing of carbon emission reductions is going to fall further. It's just not happening.
Yeah, well, on the figures, yeah. Well, there are projections, as you know, but there's projections in everything, and they're pretty unreliable. But the point is, those figures show we're virtually there already if you use carryover credits. My point is that Labor has no target, and surely it's better rather than just having no target. We all accept you want to make more medium and long-term targets as you get closer to the election, but surely now Labor's target should be the Paris Climate Agreement targets.
Well, the Paris Agreement, Chris, doesn't talk about percentages or targets. It's a commitment to keep global warming below 2 degrees and an effort to go no higher than 1.5 degrees. After the 195 nations, or whatever number it was, signed that agreement, they all went home and then made a commitment or demonstrated how they intended to make that commitment to keep warming down. And 26 to 28% is Scott Morrison's number. He's never been able to demonstrate where it comes from or any science or even arithmetic behind it. But I've said very publicly before, we should get the focus on him by at least challenging him on a daily basis to demonstrate how he's going to get to 26 or 28%.
Are you worried that some of the hysterical alarmism that's directly attributed to Australia's bushfires, bad bushfire season this year, to climate change, are you worried that that's going to force Labor into overly ambitious emissions reductions targets?
What worries me, Chris, is that the climate is changing. And if there's any chance at all that human activity is making a contribution, and I believe it is, then we should do something about it. We should embrace the precautionary principle. And in doing something about it, we need to act in a way that gives us the credibility on the international stage to preach to others who aren't taking meaningful action. And at the moment, we are the laughing stock in those international forums, mainly driven or largely driven by our determination, or Scott Morrison's determination, to rely on those carryover credits. So Scott Morrison has to get real. We're not going to be able to convince the big emitters that they need to do more if we are not able to demonstrate in those international forums that we are serious about doing something ourselves.
Well, you know that in broad terms, with that policy overview you give there, I would agree with you, except that I think Australia is doing enough for its share. But it doesn't help the argument, does it, when people are trying to blame bushfires that are not the worst we've ever seen, that occurred in conditions that were not the worst we've ever seen, and people suggesting that the climate policies of this nation could have contributed to this horrible disaster, which you would know as well as anyone, generations of Australians have faced and generations to come always will.
Well, I don't know how you say we've had worse bushfires. I mean, you can't compare bushfires of 100 years ago when people had garden hoses with bushfires of today when we've got aerial assets and all sorts of modern technology to fight them. So
but Joel Fitzgibbon, you wouldn't be unremembering Black Saturday from 2009 or Ash Wednesday from 1984, 83, or the 1967 bushfires. I mean, these firestorms occur in scorching temperatures, high winds. This is the natural environment of Australia, and to pin this one episode down to climate change is stretching the bounds of credulity, and actually holds out a false hope to people that somehow we can adopt policies in Australia that will diminish a threat that we've all known has existed in this country for millennia.
I remember Black Saturday very well. I was the Defence Minister and I was down there with our reservists by the Monday. We had them there the next evening after the fires erupted. So Scott Morrison has made some false claims there. But I've heard a number of experts, as have you, I'm sure, Chris, say that the behaviour of some of these bushfires this time around have been something they've not seen ever in the past or had recorded. But the fact is that these bushfire summers are getting hotter and drier. There's more fuel on the ground because the window of opportunity to backburn and to clean areas out is reducing. And they're the things that we should be focusing on. Of course, the climate is getting warmer. It's making the challenge more difficult. But at this point in time, we need to be talking about what we're going to do, either in resourcing or technology terms, to give ourselves greater opportunity to do the backburning that we weren't able to do over the period of the last winter and the one before that we used to be able to do.
Absolutely. Let's end on that note of agreement. Good to talk to you again, Joel Fitzgibbon. I appreciate it.
A pleasure, Chris.